All right, so are you ready to dive into one of history's biggest unsolved mysteries?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
This is Jack the Ripper,
Yeah.
the infamous serial killer who terrorized London's East End way back in 1888.
A classic.
A classic. And we've got excerpts here from the Wikipedia article on Jack the Ripper.
Oh, cool.
We're going to unpack all the details, try to get some insight into this fascinating and terrifying case.
It really is a case that just captures the imagination, doesn't it?
It does. And it's one of those that even after all these years, people are still trying to figure out.
Yeah.
So let's set the scene. 1888, London's East End. What was life like in Whitechapel during that era? What kind of world was Jack the Ripper operating in?
Well, you got to imagine a place that's just teeming with people, a lot of poverty, a lot of crime. The streets were overcrowded. Sanitation was really poor. A lot of people were living in abject poverty. It was a far cry from, the kind of romanticized image of Victorian England that we often see.
So not exactly a pleasant stroll through Hyde Park.
No, not at all.
The source material really paints a bleak picture of life for women in this environment. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it was especially difficult for women who were, driven to prostitution just to try to survive. They were incredibly vulnerable. And, they were operating in a society that, on the one hand, kind of demonized them, but on the other hand, relied upon them. The police at the time estimated that there were over 1,200 women working as prostitutes in Whitechapel at the time.
Wow, that's a staggering number. And I imagine that kind of vulnerability would make them easy targets for someone like Jack the Ripper.
Exactly.
Now, we've talked about the canonical 5 victims. What sets these murders apart from other violent crimes that were happening in Whitechapel at the time?
Right. So there were actually 11 murders that took place between 1888 and 1891 that are, collectively known as the Whitechapel murders.
Yeah.
But the level of brutality that was inflicted on these 5 women and the very specific nature of the mutilations really set them apart.
We're talking about Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. And these murders, they became a spectacle, each one seemingly more gruesome than the last.
Yeah, the details are very disturbing. All of them suffered deep throat slashes. And as the murders went on, the abdominal mutilations just got progressively more severe. Internal organs were removed in some cases. And this led to a lot of speculation about, whether the killer had anatomical knowledge or maybe even surgical skills.
It's interesting that you mentioned surgical skills. I noticed, looking through the information that you provided, that a lot of the Ripper suspects were connected to medical professions in some way.
Yeah, it's a good observation. I mean, the brutality combined with the precision of these mutilations, it really fueled a lot of speculation about the killer's background. Some people theorized that he must have had medical training. And this led investigators to look at doctors, butchers, anybody who might have had anatomical knowledge through their profession.
So the crimes themselves provided some early clues, albeit limited. Now, let's talk about the investigation. I mean, imagine trying to solve these crimes in 1888. No DNA testing, no CCTV cameras, just good old-fashioned detective work. What was that like?
It was an incredibly difficult task. The police were just overwhelmed. They conducted over 2,000 interviews. They investigated hundreds of potential suspects. But without modern forensic techniques, they were really relying on witness accounts. And those accounts were often conflicting, sometimes unreliable. They even tried things like footprint analysis, which was relatively new and untested at the time.
It sounds like they were trying to piece together this puzzle with like half the pieces missing. And to add to the chaos, they were also dealing with a media frenzy.
Right.
I mean, the Jack the Ripper persona, it was practically a media creation.
Oh, absolutely. The press just went crazy with this case. They churned out these sensationalized headlines, printing often unverified rumors and speculation, and this just fueled public fear and panic. And that made it even harder for the police to conduct a thorough investigation.
You mentioned those unverified rumors, and that brings us to something that we see in a lot of these true crime cases. The infamous letters. Apparently, the police and newspapers were bombarded with correspondence, some claiming to be from Jack himself. So what can you tell us about these letters?
The letters are really fascinating. They give us a glimpse, I think, into the psychology of, maybe the killer, but also just the public at large. Hundreds of letters were received. Some of them offered tips or theories. Others were just expressing fear or this kind of morbid fascination. But there are 3 letters that really stand out, not just because of the content, but also because of their potential connection to the killer himself.
You're talking about the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and of course the infamous From Hell letter. Why do these, in particular, capture the public imagination even now?
Well, I think the main reason is that they contain details that, at the time, seemed like only the killer could know. So, for example, the Dear Boss letter that's thought to be the first one to use the name Jack the Ripper, a name that would obviously become synonymous with the case. The Saucy Jackie postcard that was postmarked just days after two of the murders. And it kind of taunted the police with details that hadn't been released to the public yet.
And then there's From Hell, which takes things to a whole other level of disturbing.
Oh, definitely. So this letter, it arrived with a small box, and inside the box was what was believed to be half a human kidney preserved in alcohol. And the letter claimed that it belonged to one of the victims.
It's a truly chilling detail. Is there any evidence, though, to suggest that any of these letters were actually written by Jack the Ripper? Or could they have been the work of, I don't know, copycats or hoaxers trying to, capitalize on all the fear and chaos?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's one that's puzzled experts for over a century now. The authenticity of the letters has been debated endlessly. There have been handwriting analyses, linguistic comparisons, and the results are really inconclusive.
So we're left with a mystery within a mystery.
Exactly. I mean, these letters could be the key to unlocking the identity of Jack the Ripper, or they could be elaborate hoaxes designed to mislead everyone.
It's really like trying to separate fact from fiction in a ghost story. And speaking of stories, let's talk about the suspects. Who are some of the key figures that investigators really focused on?
Well, the list is long, and it includes people from all walks of life. You have local butchers and slaughterhouse workers, for example, like John Pizer, who went by the nickname Leather Apron. He was known for being violent towards prostitutes, and he seemed to fit the profile of someone who might have the anatomical knowledge to commit these types of murders.
Leather Apron. That name definitely sends chills down the spine. But was there any substantial evidence linking him to the crimes?
Not really. He actually had alibis for several of the murders, and he was eventually ruled out as a suspect. But his case just shows the challenges that the investigators were facing, trying to separate genuine leads from all these red herrings in this sea of speculation.
It sounds like they were casting a wide net, hoping to snag the right fish among all the others. Who else caught their attention?
Well, there was Montague John Druitt, a barrister who committed suicide shortly after the final canonical murder. The timing of his death raised suspicions, but there was no direct evidence connecting him to the crimes. His case is interesting because it highlights another kind of common thread that we see in a lot of these Ripper theories. This assumption that the killer had to have been someone of a certain social standing or a certain level of intellect, someone who would be capable of, evading detection for so long.
Yeah, it's interesting how societal biases can sometimes creep into even the most, serious investigations.
I think it's inevitable. This case, it challenged the very fabric of Victorian society, exposed these vulnerabilities, but also exposed a lot of prejudices.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the impact of this case. Both on Whitechapel and on, Victorian society as a whole. Was it just about, fear and headlines, or did these horrific crimes actually spark any meaningful changes?
Well, as horrible as it was, the Ripper case really did act as a catalyst for some social reform. It put a spotlight on the squalor of Whitechapel, on the poverty,
Yeah.
the lack of sanitation, the vulnerability of women, and all of these issues, while always present, were often ignored until, really, the Ripper's reign of terror made them impossible to overlook.
So in a way, these terrible events kind of forced people to confront the harsh realities of life in the East End.
Exactly. And the outcry over the Ripper's crimes and the conditions in Whitechapel, they actually led to some tangible improvements. You saw housing reforms being implemented, efforts to address poverty were stepped up, and there was a renewed focus on public safety.
So, kind of a silver lining, albeit a very tragic one. Out of all this darkness, there was a push for positive change. Now, let's delve into some of the more intriguing theories surrounding the case, maybe even some of the outlandish ones. We've talked about suspects with potential connections to, the medical field. But what about those with, ties to royalty or even, secret societies?
Oh, yeah. The world of Ripper theories. It's a wonderland of speculation.
Hmm.
One of the most persistent theories involves Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, Queen Victoria's grandson.
Wait, are we saying that Prince Albert Victor is, a serious contender here, or is this, more of a fun theory based on the information you provided?
I mean, to be clear, there's no concrete evidence linking him to the crimes, but the theory really gained traction because it tapped into a lot of anxieties that already existed about the royal family and the potential for scandal.
So a bit of tabloid fodder mixed in with a real-life murder mystery.
Exactly. And then you have these theories involving secret societies, like the Freemasons, who are often portrayed as wielding immense power and influence from the shadows.
Those always add a layer of intrigue, don't they?
They do. But like the royal theories, they often lack solid evidence, and they rely heavily on conjecture and speculation. And it's important to remember that while these theories can be really entertaining, you have to separate fact from fiction when you're examining a historical case like this.
Good point. We can indulge our curiosity without losing sight of, the truth. Now, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the victims. It's easy to get caught up in all this sensationalism, but we have to remember that these were real women whose lives were tragically cut short. What can you tell us about them?
You're absolutely right. It's vital to remember the human cost of this tragedy. They weren't just names on a police report. They were mothers, daughters, sisters, friends. They each had a story, a life that was brutally interrupted.
And from the information you've provided, all 5 of the canonical victims were women who lived and worked in Whitechapel. And many of them were struggling just to make ends meet.
Yeah, and it's also important to acknowledge that, they were involved in sex work. And that was a profession that made them particularly vulnerable in the dangerous streets of Victorian London. They lived on the margins of society, and they often face a lot of prejudice and discrimination.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that even in times of widespread fear and uncertainty, it's often the most marginalized members of society who bear the brunt of the violence.
Unfortunately, that holds true throughout history. And while the Ripper case may have brought some attention to the plight of these women, it also, in a lot of ways, reinforced existing stereotypes and prejudices.
Their stories deserve to be remembered and honored, not just as victims of this notorious killer, but as individuals who lived and breathed, and as you said, their lives were tragically cut short.
I agree. I think we can honor them by acknowledging the complexities of their lives, the challenges they faced, and the resilience they showed in the face of a lot of adversity.
Well said. Now, let's talk about how the Ripper case was handled. Let's try to put ourselves in the shoes of those investigators back in 1888. What were some of the biggest obstacles that they faced in trying to solve these crimes?
Well, aside from, the media frenzy that we've talked about and the just deluge of letters that they were receiving, both genuine and fake, they were really working with extremely limited resources. Forensic science was in its infancy. Fingerprinting, for example, was just starting to gain traction as a legitimate investigative tool, and DNA analysis, of course, was decades away.
So they were relying heavily on witness statements, which, as we've discussed, could be unreliable, and whatever physical evidence they could gather from the crime scenes.
Yeah, and you have to remember, this was a time before widespread street lighting. So a lot of these crimes took place in, essentially, darkness, which made it incredibly difficult to find reliable witnesses or preserve crucial evidence.
The source material mentions that investigators collected forensic material, like footprints, but without a database to compare them to, their usefulness was pretty limited.
Exactly. It's really fascinating to think about how this case might have unfolded with today's technology and investigative techniques.
We'd probably have DNA evidence, CCTV footage, sophisticated profiling tools, but back then it was just a much more laborious and frustrating process. Did investigators make any attempts, though, to try to understand the psychology of the killer? To create some kind of profile that might help them predict his next move?
They did. Actually, the Ripper case is considered a landmark in the development of criminal profiling, even if the methods they were using were, pretty rudimentary compared to today's standards.
And the information we have here mentions Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon who offered this really detailed assessment of the killer based on the crime scenes and the nature of the mutilations. What did his profile reveal?
Well, remember, this was before the days of modern psychology. So Bond's assessment was based largely on, his observations, deductions. He described the killer as likely being someone of solitary habits, probably subject to what he called periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania. He even speculated that the mutilations might be indicative of a condition called satyriasis, which is an excessive and uncontrollable sexual desire in men.
Satyriasis. It's not a term we hear very often. It's basically a condition that's characterized by an obsessive need for sexual gratification, often manifesting in aggressive or violent behavior.
Exactly. And while Bond's assessment, again, was based on pretty limited information, it did give investigators at least a framework for trying to understand the potential motivations and maybe the psychological makeup of the killer.
It's amazing to think about how much forensic psychology has evolved since then, but even with Bond's insights, the killer remained elusive.
He did. And maybe that's part of the reason why this case continues to fascinate us, right? It's a reminder that some mysteries may never be fully solved, some questions may never have definitive answers.
We're left with a collection of clues, a cast of intriguing suspects, and this chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the shadows of even, the most civilized societies.
But maybe there's a certain beauty in that uncertainty. It keeps the case alive. It sparks our imaginations. It encourages us to, delve deeper into this historical context and to really explore the many facets of this enduring mystery.
It's a puzzle that we keep trying to solve, even though, some pieces might be missing forever. And in trying to solve it, we learn not just about the past, but also about ourselves, our own fascination with true crime, our desire for justice, and, this enduring need to make sense of the world, even the darkest corners of it.
And speaking of those dark corners, it's worth talking about the Ripper's lasting legacy. I mean, this case, it's transcended the boundaries of true crime, and it's seeped into popular culture in ways that very few other historical events have.
Yeah, he's almost like a mythical figure now, like this boogeyman who embodies our deepest feels about violence and the unknown.
Exactly. And that kind of mythologizing, it's just fueled this fascination that continues to this day. He's inspired countless books, movies, video games. He's become like this staple of our collective imagination.
And it's not just about entertainment, right? I mean, a lot of these creative interpretations often reflect the anxieties and the preoccupations of the time in which they were created. Like early 20th century depictions often focused on the Ripper as this monstrous figure, this, bogeyman lurking in the shadows. But then later interpretations tended to portray him as a more complex, even sympathetic character.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. It's like he's become this blank canvas onto which we project our own fears, our fascinations, even our desires.
Like, take, for example, Alan Moore's graphic novel From Hell. It goes beyond that kind of typical whodunit, and it really delves into the social and political climate of Victorian London. It uses the Ripper case as a lens through which to examine issues of class, power, gender.
It's a prime example of how the Ripper story can be used to explore those deeper themes, those kind of societal anxieties that were bubbling beneath the surface.
So we have this really fascinating interplay between history, mystery, and creative interpretation. But as we continue to dissect this case, analyze all these clues, ponder the suspects, I think it's important to also consider the ethical implications of our fascination. Where do we draw the line between, historical curiosity and the exploitation of a tragedy?
That's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in the intrigue of a case like this, to lose sight of the human cost. We have to remember that these were real people whose lives were tragically cut short.
And their families and loved ones still carry the weight of that loss, even after all this time.
Absolutely. So as we continue to explore the mystery of Jack the Ripper, I think we have to do it with sensitivity and with respect, always mindful of the human element at the heart of this very tragic story. We can be fascinated by the puzzle, by the historical and cultural significance of the case, without glorifying the violence or forgetting the victims.
Well said. It's a delicate balance, but it's one that's definitely worth striving for. Now, let's shift our focus to, I think, one of the most captivating aspects of this case, the psychological puzzle of Jack the Ripper. What can we glean about the killer from his actions, from the choices that he made, from the victims that he targeted?
That's where things get really interesting and honestly a bit disturbing. We're trying to understand the mind of someone who committed these acts of unspeakable brutality, someone who seemingly just vanished into thin air. And even with, over a century of hindsight, we're still left with more questions than answers.
And some experts believe, based on the information we have here from Wikipedia, that the killer might have had a very specific hatred of women, particularly women who were involved in sex work. They point to the brutality of the attacks, the focus on mutilating the victims' bodies, as potential evidence of this misogyny.
That's certainly one interpretation,
Hmm.
and it's one that aligns with some of the societal anxieties of the time, anxieties about female sexuality, about the role of women in society, of the potential for women to challenge these traditional power structures.
It's like the Ripper case became this focal point for all those anxieties, almost a symbol of this perceived threat that women, especially women who defied societal norms, represented.
Exactly, and sadly, those anxieties haven't entirely disappeared, even in our modern world. We still see instances of violence against women, of attempts to control and restrict their agency.
Yeah, it's a sobering reminder that while we've made progress in many areas, there's still work to be done in terms of achieving true equality and ending violence against women. Now, going back to the killer's psychology, what other insights can we glean from the available evidence?
Well, I think one of the most intriguing aspects of this case is the apparent escalation in the level of violence over time. The early murders were brutal, but as they went on, they became even more frenzied, more savage. And this could suggest that the killer was becoming more confident, more emboldened by his ability to evade capture.
Or perhaps the killings themselves were becoming a kind of macabre ritual, with each subsequent murder feeding this growing need for power and control.
That's a chilling thought, isn't it? And it raises these questions about what might have happened if the Ripper hadn't stopped killing when he did. Would the violence have continued to escalate? Would he have become even bolder, even more brazen in his actions?
Yeah, it's definitely a thought that sends chills down the spine. And I think it speaks to the enduring power of this case, its ability to tap into our deepest fears, our anxieties about the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most seemingly civilized societies.
Yeah, it forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about our capacity for violence, about the fragility of order and security.
And maybe that's why, even after all these years, we're still so drawn to this mystery. It's a reminder that the past is never truly past, that the shadows of history can still reach out and touch us, and that the quest to understand that darkness within ourselves and the world around us is a never-ending journey.
And it's a journey that can be fascinating and terrifying, enlightening and unsettling. But I think it's a journey worth taking. It's only to remind ourselves that the world is this complex and often contradictory place where light and darkness exist in this constant state of tension.
It's a world where monsters can lurk in the shadows, but it's also a world where heroes rise to meet the challenge, where justice is sought, where stories are told, and where the search for truth continues, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. We've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into Jack the Ripper.
We have.
I mean, we've explored the grim realities of life in Whitechapel, back in 1888. We examined those brutal details of the murders. We tried to understand, some of the social and psychological factors that might have contributed to this horrific chapter in history.
Yeah.
But as we kind of approach the end of our exploration here, I'm left with this lingering question.
Okay.
Why, after all these years, does the mystery of Jack the Ripper continue to captivate us?
It's a good question. It's one that has puzzled historians, criminologists, armchair detectives, all of us really, for generations. And I think there are a few factors at play here. I think first and foremost, there's just the inherent mystery of an unsolved case. The fact that the killer was never caught.
Right.
The fact that he seemingly vanished into thin air.
Right.
That leaves this void that our imaginations just rush to fill.
It's like an unfinished story, right? Like a puzzle with missing pieces. Our brains crave that resolution, that sense of closure, and this case just doesn't offer that.
It doesn't. And that lack of closure really allows the legend to grow.
Right.
To take on a life of its own. We project our fears onto it, our own theories onto this blank canvas of the unknown.
But it's not just about the mystery, though, is it?
No.
I mean, there's something about the setting, right? Victorian London with its gaslights and fog-shrouded streets.
Right.
It just adds this extra layer of intrigue.
Definitely. The Ripper case, it's inextricably linked to that particular time and place.
Right.
A period of great social change and a lot of upheaval.
Yeah. The late Victorian era was a time of such rapid industrialization, urbanization, growing class divisions.
Absolutely.
And beneath that veneer of progress and prosperity, there was this darker undercurrent of poverty, of crime, of social unrest.
For sure. And the Ripper case really exposed those tensions, those cracks in the facade of Victorian society.
Yeah.
And it did so in a way that was both shocking and, I think, a little bit titillating to people.
Yeah, it's like the case tapped into this collective anxiety, a fear of the unknown, of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of, even the most civilized societies.
And that fear, that anxiety, is something that we still grapple with today.
Of course.
In different forms. We live in a world where violence and uncertainty are kind of ever present. We're bombarded with all this news of terrorism, of mass shootings, of political instability.
So maybe our fascination with the Ripper case is a way of confronting those fears.
Yeah, possibly.
Of kind of exploring that dark side of human nature in a safe, controlled environment. It's a form of escapism, yeah. But it can also be a way of engaging with some really difficult questions.
Right.
About morality, about justice, about the limits of our own understanding.
And maybe there's a certain comfort in knowing that even in the face of such horrific acts
Yeah.
that the human spirit endures,
Uh-huh.
The Ripper case, for all its darkness, I think it also highlights that resilience of the human spirit, the determination to seek justice, to find meaning, even in the face of tragedy.
Yeah, and I think we see that resilience in the work of the investigators,
Yeah.
in the efforts of social reformers who are trying to improve the lives of people who are living in poverty, and, in the countless writers, artists, filmmakers who have kind of used the Ripper case as a springboard for exploring these deeper themes about human nature and the complexities of the world we live in.
So while the mystery of Jack the Ripper might never be fully solved,
Right.
the case itself, it continues to offer us these really valuable insights into the human condition, both its darkest impulses, but also its brightest hopes. Absolutely. It's a reminder that even in the face of, really unimaginable evil, there's always hope.
Mm,
There's always the possibility of redemption. There's
yeah.
always that drive to understand, to learn, and to grow.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive.
Okay.
We've explored the facts, we've pondered the theories, we've delved into the psychology of the killer, and we've considered that lasting impact of this case on society, on popular culture.
We've really gone deep.
Yeah, we've journeyed all the way back to the fog-choked streets of Whitechapel, and we've hopefully emerged with, a deeper understanding not only of the case itself, but also of ourselves, our own fears, our fascinations, and our, enduring need to make sense of the world around us.
Absolutely.
So, dear listener, as you step back into your own life, carry with you the echoes of this case.
Yeah.
Remember the victims, honor their memory, and let their stories serve as this reminder of the importance of empathy, of compassion, and, the pursuit of justice.
And remember that the world is full of mysteries,
Yeah.
big and small,
Yeah.
waiting to be explored.
Yeah.
So keep your eyes open, your mind sharp,
Mm.
and never lose your sense of curiosity.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.